Don't forget, we do have some presentations happening in the market hall just next door. You will have heard some clapping. There's some great projects being showcased over there. If you're interested, please check out the app. All right, we were discussing the housing undersupply, and now we're really going to get into it. It's a genuine delight to extend a warm welcome to our next panel, who'll be joining me on stage. In this session, we're going to be discussing innovative housing models addressing the missing middle and lessons for the industry. Today on stage will be joining me Tim Riley from Property Collectives, Natalie Raymond from Walter Consulting and YIMBY Queensland, and Panos, I'm absolutely going to murder this, Miltadum from Lucent, please welcome stage as well. So I'm glad you braved it. It's a bit chilly out there today. So obviously housing is a major challenge at the moment, and I'm keen to perhaps get your perspective on how we can address it in more innovative ways, because we've got a lot of challenges out there in terms of delivery. But before we get into it, I might just get you all to speak a bit about what you're about and what you're seeing out in the market. Tim?
Yep, so I run Property Collectives. We've been evolving a co-build model since 2010. So we've put together 10 projects building 82 homes, where we empower groups of people to produce their homes by allowing them to become co-developers. And then in the last year, we've also been looking at housing co-op structure and the potential for that to create almost like a new tenure. Because at the moment it's very binary in the property market. You either own your home or you're in the private rental market, and there's nothing in between. So we sort of think that's an interesting space.
Yeah, keen to dig into that a bit more in a minute. Natalie?
So I'm a town planner, obviously, at Walter Consulting Group. So we're working, I guess, in development consultancy for planning, surveying, design, project delivery for a whole range of projects. But certainly the ones that are coming across my desk are the luxury level of apartments and the social and affordable housing projects that are getting some funding through the HIFs and the HAFs and other funding mechanisms. But everything else in between, we're also getting a lot of traction going through some of the new state facilitated development pathways.
Yeah, so that's a very Queensland context, but yes.
Yes, and also co-founder of YIMBY Queensland, yes, in my backyard, so always out there saying, yes, let's get these things happening.
But it's yes to good design.
Absolutely, good outcomes, good development.
Panos, please tell me how to pronounce your name.
So Panos Miltiadou, so Lucent's the business that I run, so residential property development, specifically middle ring, so in this target zone, anything from apartments up to 6-7 levels to townhomes, and with a focus on sustainable outcomes, and probably a middle offering rather than a high-end offering is what our target's been. Just trying to deliver that product into the marketplace, specifically Melbourne, I might add as well. So I'm holding on.
Okay, excellent. I was talking to Ilan Samuel last night at our welcome party, and he said that the catch cry is survive to 25 in Melbourne. So hopefully you're all holding on with your nails. Tim, I'm interested to hear a bit more about that co-tenure or co-ownership tenure. How does it work in practical terms? Because I know the initial thing that you did was kind of like a townhouse project with 3 other people. Is that right? I'm murdering this.
Yeah, I suppose the co-build model we've been running is really a joint venture structure. So it's about getting the end users, the end occupiers of the homes in and helping them co-design and co-build their future homes. And I suppose we're turning the role of the developer into a service provider. We're sort of their technical support, but they're bringing the equity, and then they get their homes at cost, right? So from that perspective, it allows you to deliver innovative outcomes, because the client group is the occupiers, and they are driving that design process, which means that we're able to deliver outcomes that the sort of more speculative off the plan market just doesn't deliver because there's too much risk involved in that for speculative developers. So so for instance, we just finished 10 apartments in West Brunswick with a star rating of between 9 to 9.5 stars. The group, spent around about 15% more than what, your base level of design was to achieve that outcome, because they were really interested in zero operating costs.
So is it
having
the cost
high-
saving as well as that sustainability piece?
That was the driver.
Yeah.
But I mean, when they made the investment decision to do the build, it was on like a 7 or 8% margin. So, the project wouldn't have gone ahead if it was a speculative development. But for these guys, it's a long-term asset for them. So, they weren't happy about the price, but they were cognizant of the fact that it's just where the market sits. So, I think that's where these sort of models can, you can get things done in more difficult environments by sort of tweaking the financial model, really. Yeah.
And it's primarily in kind of infill opportunities, isn't it?
Yeah. All the projects we've done are infill. I suppose that's where the people that are interested in participating, that's where they want to live, and they sort of see it's a group buy. They get the economies of scale. They're probably getting into an area that they couldn't afford otherwise if they were just doing it by themselves. So I think that's sort of attractive.
It is interesting. Obviously, in the current market, we've got the very expensive downsizer market, the very expensive high-end resi, and then the affordable and social end, and that missing middle is such a challenge. Nat, can you give us a feel for, I guess, the split in terms of what you're seeing in the market, and any ideas you've got in terms of how we do address that?
Well, I think we've been talking about that missing middle for a long time, and we're certainly coming off, the back of townhouse bans that were being affected into our system only, 4 to 6 years ago. So we've come from rock bottom, and we're finding certainly better ways, faster ways, cheaper ways, hopefully, and better ways to deliver at least planning approvals for these sorts of projects, whether the construction costs can then meet that. So it has been a lot of work in trying to find alternative pathways for these sorts of projects, whether by a different name, a different planning approval, a different level of government approving it, just to get these back into the market. But traditionally, and it continues to be a challenge, particularly in infill areas, which is often where we want to see these projects with the community sentiment. So I love these new and different ideas, because I think that sort of shifts the community discussion around those projects, and especially when they're great design outcomes, great sustainability outcomes, it's something that perhaps the community can actually see. People need to see something, to believe in something, and then get behind it. So I think we're moving forward. But we've got a long way to go, and it's a bit of a mix.
How much of that needs to be density, though? Because we're seeing a lot of policy around infill development, and then TODs. But how much of that missing middle needs to be addressed with medium density apartment blocks?
I don't know the absolute split, but I would say that in every neighbourhood we need to have different forms of housing to meet the demographics of that neighbourhood or that suburb or that locality. So we need to get better at providing different housing, different forms of housing, different tenures of housing across that whole spectrum. And if we can do it in every neighbourhood, great. We're certainly getting some interesting policy out there that's a bit more comfortable policies, saying let's do it in the right locations, perhaps locations that aren't going to be as contentious within a community. I would hope that one day we can get to a point where that could be, in every neighbourhood, living side by side.
And Panos, perhaps you can tell us a bit about your story and how you've gone about it.
Yeah, I was going to add to that as well. So if I look at Melbourne as an example, as part of the 1.2 million homes over 5 years, where Victoria as a whole has to deliver 80-odd thousand homes a year, which we're well behind in. And then on top of that, some of the policy changes to support it, a la, activity centres, improving density, and as of right, planning outcome, be it 4 levels, that's only contributing 60,000 homes over that journey of 5 years. So this missing middle is super important because it just means that we're either going into high rise or we're pushing it further out again in terms of this urban sprawl. And we know that's not sustainable, and we know that costs a lot more. So the missing middle is unbelievably important, and then it's how to do that. Now, traditional developers like myself, we're looking for properties within that missing middle, but we're operating to the zonings that we're allowed to play with. And then those opportunities obviously bought and capitalised if we can, and then it's the models that then come to try and do it differently. As a business, we've tried 3 different things, which is, the brownfield site, people might know it as dirty sites. Let's go and buy a dirty site that the industry is ignoring with a view that we can repair it, clean it, remediate it, and that'll keep our cost base low and produce, density that's affordable. So that's one model. We've done that a couple of times. Then there's other models in shared relationships where it might be a non-for-profit model. As an example, we partnered with Nightingale on a project where we subsidised part of that housing to try and complete a development in Brunswick East. That was quite successful. And then we go to the more affluent suburbs to try and play in those areas, and then the NIMBYism is overwhelming to the point that your yield is so dramatically affected that you are then changing your whole outcome, and it's becoming luxury. And I think that's where the missing middle is now. We're turning these into known zones, luxury apartments, but we're not actually addressing what is, and I'm not talking social because that's another field, but what is affordable to most people. How do we address that component? And that's the real challenge.
Because you're obviously facing that planning risk exposure as well if you're doing something that doesn't sit inside that neat little box. How much of policy do you think is hindering this innovation in this missing middle area?
I think it's overwhelming in terms of the effect it could have if policy changed. So, fast track planning, yep, that's absolutely a step. And I acknowledge that this is over time. It can't all be done in one hit. But, there was neighbourhood residential zoning essentially in Victoria, which was you could probably do 1 or 2 on a block. The government then introduced garden space requirements, which then killed that, so that became harder to do. So then it pushed it to growth residential zoning. That's, there's not a lot of that supply, so it's very competitive, price points are high. So how does policy change? By allowing more development, by allowing more development in some of these areas. Jonathan in Melbourne, as part of YIMBY, put out a great paper where there was 13 action points saying this is what we should change from a policy perspective to try and encourage that middle ring development. Some of them are quite aggressive, but can be done over time. But neighbourhood residential to growth, as an example, growth then moving into commercial zoning, which unlocks that opportunity. And if it's done, I suppose, en masse, then it doesn't have the inevitable effect of rezoning, which is property prices follow, and then it's still unaffordable, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, but policy plays a huge role in this in terms of unlocking what can and can't be developed.
Yeah, Nat, you've certainly agitated on this front, can you?
Totally agree, and I think there's plenty of commentators out there saying no, planning's a side issue, but it's absolutely front and centre. And if the head of Nightingale Property can sit there, or even a housing minister can sit there on national television and say, this is in my way, this is making it slower, it's making it more cost effective, it makes me not be able to deliver this housing at all. We're not even talking about construction costs if you can't even do the development, or you can't even consider that form of development in that location at this point in time. It's absolutely front and centre.
Did you encounter a lot of NIMBYism when you pushed your projects out?
Yeah, we've just got a permit for 21 homes in Eltham, which is sort of a bit very middle ring, I suppose, in Melbourne. We ran up against probably one of the most NIMBY councils, and they refused our 21 homes in a mixed-use zone, and you couldn't see it from the street. So we had to go to VCAT. Spent about $300K on consultants to get that result, and luckily, once the adults were in the room at the VCAT tribunal, we got we got support and got an approval. But yeah, I mean, it was a lot of my experience has been with Darebin and Marybeck, which are inner city councils. They seem to be quite enlightened, which is a positive. But yeah, for me, it was a bit scary to see how backwards a sort of more outer suburban council could be when confronted with density. Yeah, so it's a challenge.
There's a few questions coming from the audience for you, Tim, which I might just put to you. Someone's asked how you go about obtaining finance on a property collective development, given that it's a fragmented ownership model.
Yep. It's a good question. So we basically use a Landco and a DevCo. We dress it up to look very similar to a normal speculative development. The only thing is that we don't have off the plan sales. So given it's a joint venture, you have joint venturers and they provide their financials to the bank. So from a bank's perspective, while it's not arm's length, they also have a much greater visibility over the financial capacity of the group. And when we're going for construction, they can then sort of see, well, what's the takeout strategy for each of the members of the group, because they're basically dividing the construction line by the number of dwellings that you're building. So from that perspective, I mean, it's taken a while for us to get to the point where we've got a number of different lenders that lend against the structure, but yeah, it's fairly straightforward.
And do you think that's a scalable solution? Is there like a ceiling limit as to how far you can push it, do you think?
Look, we're working with one group looking at doing 30 dwellings. I mean, when I started, we did 4, and then we did 5 and 6. So, the Eltham project's 20. Yeah, probably in my mind, I think probably 30 would be probably the upper range. We sort of start to, the structure starts to get a bit unwieldy. But, I think 30 is still, in an infill context, it's still a meaningful size if we're talking about middle ring, middle
and certainly
suburbs.
in addition to a market that's crying out for housing.
Yeah.
There's another question here around whether you could perhaps make this work in terms of getting your foot in the door for property ownership, but on leasehold land. Is that something that you've looked at before or would consider?
Yeah, so I mentioned at the top that we're working on a housing co-op model.
Which kind of already exists, right? There's co-ops down in
There is
Victoria
co-ops.
particularly, but
Look, I think there's about 6,000 housing co-op units across the country. It's a very small sector. But I think one of the challenges we're going to see in Middle Ring is this viability piece. You sort of mentioned, what I'm seeing in Melbourne is you have luxury, which is fine, and it's just chugging along, and then you have social affordable, and it requires subsidy, and there's only so much subsidy, and then in the middle, it's really struggling. Like, I think in a Melbourne context, if you're not getting 13 to 15 grand a square metre value rates, an apartment building's not going to happen. Yep. Maybe in townies it's sort of 11, 12. So yeah, we sort of see that there's really not much supply that's going to be delivered by the off-the-plan construct over the short term. So we're looking at how you can use a housing co-op structure that takes a long-term land lease to turn it into effectively a cash flow business. So you sort of you're flipping the structure, and instead of people owning land, they are owning a share in the housing co-op, and that gives them a right of residency for as long as that co-op controls the land lease.
Yeah, right. So there's no kind of end date to the tenure, really.
Well, I think if it was a local council in a Melbourne context, I think they can only legally give a 50-year land lease. But it's starting to happen in Melbourne. There's quite a few sort of land lease deals done for infill sites. Mostly it's government enabling them, but there's a couple of private ones through Assemble, where they're looking at that sort of 50, 60, 70-year land lease before a reversion event. So yeah, we're exploring that as a potential, because all of a sudden you're taking the capital cost of the land at the front end out of the FISO, and you're reducing the deposit for someone to secure housing, and really reducing that and turning it into a sort of like an at cost BTR effectively.
Yeah. Nat and Panos, I'm keen to hear, I guess, your experiences at the coalface as to whether people's expectations around housing is changing. Are we more open to the idea of apartment living, do you think?
I think we are. I think there's still a lot of stigma around the sector, though. You know, poor quality outcomes, defecting. Pardon me. You know, builders in particular. Like, you know, we've got a project at the minute, and you know, yes, we see you, but who's your builder? Is becoming the biggest question because of all the fall downs and stop starts and duration. But I think the market's still, you know, there in terms of apartments. It's also there's a big vacancy now that we've seen. You know, specifically, you know, New South Wales and Victoria in terms of the amount that's being delivered. So apartments are absolutely part of the solution. The days of being able to stick to a medium house price in a townhouse development within that middle ring. So, you know, if something's selling for 1.1, we can reproduce that for 1.1. Those days are gone. But if you want to live in those inner city locations, good amenity, good access, then it may be a 3-bedroom apartment at 1.1 as an example. So I think that's well received, it's accepted, but it's now the quality. Our buyer has never been more educated, I think across Australia, by the way, but has never been more educated. They know what bad looks like because they've seen it in the news. Then they can do their own research as to who is good and bad in terms of development, as well as, you know, sponsor. So in that context, I think it's a very educated marketplace who are buying, you know, smarter. We've just got to meet those needs as an industry as well.
Yeah, meeting those needs is increasingly challenging, though, it would seem. What is the price point for that missing middle, do you think? How much money are we talking for an apartment?
You know, in our context, you're always benchmarked on what's selling. This is the thing. So by way of example, in Northcote in Melbourne, so probably 6K out of the CBD, just using this example, medium house price for a 3-bedroom home is, you know, 1.4 to 1.6, in that range, depending on size. But let's just call that 1.5. That's what people benchmark their purchase on in off the plan. So there's got to be a benefit, and they'll pay more, but I should get something bigger, better, more suited, better located than what I could buy. So they're still benchmarking that let's call it that current median price. And then apartments a little bit different in thought process. I think people are prepared to pay a little bit more for the right quality outcomes. And that's based on also the market we're selling to at the minute, which is probably that downsizer or upsizer. We're not necessarily selling to first home buyers. They're not there yet. But when they do come, it'll all be affordability, right? It'll all be, you know, how much deposit, what will a bank lend me? I'm being measured differently in my repayment capability. So that'll become a price point market. And that's where we've got to be careful with quality outcomes as well, you know, in terms of our sector. But still very much medium price. There's still, research is there. You just get on realestate.com and you know exactly what you're paying.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that actually apartment owners are also NIMBYs out there now, and so it's actually, I think that there is a lot of community acceptance of living in apartments, and you know it's a choice for a lot of people, and you know, depending on their values and their lifestyle and their demographics. And I think we used to traditionally think that the NIMBY was the person in the single family, you know, house, not wanting anything to change in their street, not wanting a different form of housing, whether that be a duplex or an apartment. But you know, you read just as many submissions and negative comments on all of the different Facebook groups that are actually coming from all of the residents of one apartment building about the apartment building that's going on next door. So there's a lot of acceptance and pride, but equally just as much, perhaps stigma about what's that new one, or fear of what the quality of the new development is going to be in their neighbourhood.
Do you think social media has given people license to complain about things a lot more as well? Like, has it enabled them to be, I guess, a more mobilised group of dissidents, disobedient
Absolutely.
minds, as Kate said earlier today?
I love the disobedient minds, but yes, it certainly is. There's a lot of conversations in every Facebook group about development. It's a hot topic, and it makes it very easy to get a lot of objections or submissions to projects. And hopefully, by design, it creates just as many opportunities for people to say yes. It's just that it's harder to get people actively out there saying yes.
But this is also where policy plays a big role. Like, two projects, two different stories. One that we had with 14 apartments, 3 levels, and it was very much defined by council. You can do this, this height, that density, this amenity outcomes. Anything outside of that, we'll reject it. So we knew the box in which to create, if that makes sense, and we knew what stepping over the line would look like in terms of costs, holding costs, etc., to get more. We stuck to the profile, and we had no complaints because that had also been introduced to residents in that neighbourhood over time. They'd complained 5 years ago when it was introduced. Now it's accepted. It's more around street character. Is it, yep, it fits my street. It's not an ugly, it's well designed, so we'll accept. On the flip side, where there's ambiguity in planning, in the Middle Ring in particular, well, you're landing a spaceship in our suburb. You are so foreign, it's not funny. Let's object. We've got no clarity. And then, one of our projects had 127 objectors. We ended up going to compulsory conference, sitting there and re-explaining what they already had in front of them, if that makes sense. Oh, okay, now we understand. This wasn't explained. You're not going 7 levels. Okay, right. Just silly things, but that clarity wasn't there, which drove the social media nightmare for us.
Yes.
Versus clarity, just smooth sailing and a quicker project overall.
And how does inclusionary zoning play into this as well? Because, in a lot of jurisdictions, you can get uplift in terms of the number of apartments you can do if you're including social and affordable housing. Does it help to unlock some of those sites a bit more if you can do that?
Totally.
To hit that middle area?
I was just going to say, because the one of the solutions to the missing middle is to rezone and make things more available for development. The disaster with that also is that now my land is worth more. I own it, it's been rezoned, so I'm going to sell it to a developer for a lot more. So price points, there's no benefit, if that makes sense. If you unlock an opportunity for some value, and inclusionary zoning means you must provide with whatever metrics, and I'm loose on that in terms of what that means in terms of affordability and so forth. But if those inclusionary measures can be included in that uplift, then you get better design outcomes. It also means the price isn't here, it might be here, if that makes sense, because there is a component that a developer can only realise with gross revenue, not over over and above. So inclusionary zoning is unbelievable if unlocked in that middle ring. I think it can really benefit it.
Mindful that we're out of time, but if you could fix one thing to sort of address this great hulking issue, what would you do, Tim?
I think it's all about finance. I think it's all about finance. I don't know. I think the government probably needs to look at how it can make debt or equity cheaper somehow if it wants these outcomes, if it's serious about its housing targets. I think that's what everybody's grappling with at the moment.
A few non-bank lenders in the audience if you want to go hit them up later. Nat?
I'd make the development process less adversarial. I think we need to get that community engagement happening way earlier and stop making it the developer's problem.
Yeah, I loved what Kate said earlier about engaging community, about what they want and how to approach it from ground up. Panos?
I think some rezoning. I think a lot of rezoning, to be blunt, would help. I think what it'd also do is trying to encourage that smaller developer back into the market. The Middle Ring traditionally has had a smaller developer, the 1 or 2 or 3 townhome type developer, or 4-level building, smaller apartment development type. The marketplace at the minute is such that that developer almost doesn't exist, and they will carry a lot of the weight. So how do you encourage them back? Rezoning, more opportunities for them, and to Tim's point, finance is important. And I think there's a lack of understanding in equity and debt in some cases, and the benefits of private credit as well, how it can help.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've had some great insights today. We will be getting more into it in the great debate, which mainlines tomorrow afternoon. So I encourage you all to get along to that. It'll be spicy, Nat promises. Please thank my guests. We've had Tim Riley from Property Collectors, Natalie Raymond from Yimby, Queensland, and Panos Miltiades
Well, with that.
from Lucent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.